When you saw the bee just drifting by at the edge of the garden, you probably didn't stop. Why would you, anyway? It seemed to be following the same path over and over, to the same flower, at the same time every day. But this morning, the moment it landed on that lavender stem, something happened. Within seconds, it took off into the air again, as if it hadn't taken anything. Or had it? And where did it go? It disappeared at the far end of the garden. Every day, it just vanished like that, in the same direction. This might seem very ordinary, actually, but the truth is far from it. By the time this video ends, on any given evening as you're eating dinner or just sitting at home, that bee circling in your garden will be sealing the honeycomb cells with millimeter-level precision, just like an interior architect designing a building. Meanwhile, another bee, without any GPS, will be guiding the hive to a field exactly 3 kilometers away. And perhaps right at this very moment, in the darkness outside, tens of thousands of colony members inside the hive are making a decision and casting their votes. Welcome back to the Bees Around Us channel. Before we start the video, I'd like you to click the subscribe button, because this channel approaches everything you take for granted from a completely different perspective. Finally, we'll discuss how. That tiny bee, without even realizing it, helps maintain the food balance. That's why I want you to stick around until the very end. So let's start with point 1. 1. Bees start their day early with discipline and are never late. Even before the sun is high in the sky, the worker bees in the hive are already hard at work. But this isn't just about waking up early. Their eyes work fundamentally differently from ours. We see colors ranging from red to purple, but bees can't see red. In contrast, they can see ultraviolet light, which we cannot perceive very clearly. In that first faint dull light of morning, before you've even opened the curtains, the lavender in your garden is already shining as brightly as midday in their eyes. In fact, a dark morning is never an obstacle for them, because the ultraviolet light is still there. Moreover, a worker bee makes an average of 12 to 15 flights per day. When you factor in about 3 kilometers per flight, that adds up to a total of 24 to 30 kilometers a day. So we could say it's equivalent to a marathon runner. But of course, that runner runs while resting, eating, and drinking water. A bee, on the other hand, gathers, carries, and navigates on every flight. Moreover, it can carry a load of up to nearly 80% of its own body weight, just like a 60-kilogram person carrying 48 kilograms on their back. And it does this while flying. Just imagine how difficult that is. Of course, this pace comes at a cost. A worker bee's lifespan is only 6 weeks. A large portion of those 6 weeks is spent at exactly this speed and pace. By the end of its life, its wings are visibly worn out and exhausted. Often, it can no longer return to the hive. It remains outside, just like that, in that state. So what does this mean for you? That bee you saw through the window that morning is right in the middle of its 6-week lifespan, and within the limited time allotted to it, it starts its work every morning for exactly this reason. 2. While collecting pollen, a bee essentially transforms its body into a factory. When a bee lands on a flower, the only thing we can see is a brief pause. Within seconds, it lands, gathers pollen, and flies back. From our perspective, this seems very simple. But in those few seconds, 3 separate processes are happening simultaneously inside its body. First, electrostatic charge. As the bee flies, it gains a positive charge. Flowers, on the other hand, are negatively charged. While still in the air, pollen grains are drawn toward the bee and stick to it before it even lands. It works like a vacuum cleaner with a dust-sprinkling mechanism, but here, The vacuum cleaner is moving, and the dust is coming toward it. The moment it lands, the second process kicks in immediately. Its body is covered in forked hairs, and the pollen gets caught in these forks. The bee gathers the pollen with its front legs, transfers it to its middle legs, and then flings it toward its hind legs. There's a special groove on the hind leg, surrounded by hairs. The pollen is compressed into this cavity, moistened with nectar and saliva, and bound together. Those two yellow balls you see while the bee is flying are exactly that. The third process is an internal system. The bee also collects nectar and fills a special honey stomach. The capacity of this stomach is approximately 40 milligrams. The bee's total weight is 80 milligrams. So, when full, it can carry nearly half its own weight inside. And the transformation begins even before it reaches the hive. Enzymes go to work along the way. So the moment that bee lands on a flower, it simultaneously becomes a pollinator, a carrier, and a factory. If it has liquid droplets on its hind legs, it means it's right in the middle of its work. 3. It can regulate the hive's temperature and does so with virtually zero error. Here's the thing. If you had the chance to go inside a hive and were carrying a thermometer, you'd be surprised. Even if it's scorching hot outside at 40 degrees, inside it's 34 to 35 degrees. Even if the outside temperature drops to 10 degrees, it remains between 34 and 35 degrees. This range is constant, maintained with near millimeter precision. And it's not a thermostat, a heater, or an air conditioner that makes this possible. It's thousands of bees. So why exactly this temperature? Because for the larvae in the honeycomb cells, this range is a matter of life and death. According to research, even a deviation of just 1 to 2 degrees can cause permanent damage to some of the larvae. Their wings don't open fully, and they can't fly. The hive knows this. That's why the entire system works so meticulously. Of course, when the temperature drops, the first response is muscle vibration. Worker bees generate heat without flying, simply by vibrating their thoracic muscles. They cluster close together, squeezing into a tight ball to create shared heat. From the outside, they appear motionless. Inside, thousands of muscles are working. When the temperature rises, the system reverses. A group of bees lines up at the entrance and fans their wings, pushing hot air out. Another group carries water and spreads it over the honeycomb surfaces. The airflow created by the wings evaporates this water, cooling the interior. This is the same principle as an air conditioner, but bees have been doing this for millions of years. Furthermore, there is no central coordination. Each bee senses the temperature around itself and acts accordingly. Thousands of individual decisions produce a single, flawless result. In addition, even though the hive may seem quiet on autumn mornings, the system is operating at full capacity inside. Keep the front of the hive open and sheltered from the wind. The bees will take care of the rest. 4. The hive votes and always conforms equally to the majority. Naturally, as fall approaches, a quiet tension begins to build within the hive. The hive has become overcrowded, and resources are running low. The queen begins preparing to swarm. A large group will split off to establish a new nest. But who decides where they'll go? The answer is surprising. They all decide together. Essentially, the hive sends out special scout bees. These bees survey the surroundings and examine suitable locations. When they return to the hive, they describe the places they like through dance. But this dance isn't a map. It's a campaign. Each scout bee advocates for the location it has found. The more energetic the dance, the higher the confidence in that location. There's also this fact. Observers go and check out the spot in person. If they like it, they support the same dance. As the number of supporters grows, the dance gains strength. Those dancing for weaker locations slow down and stop their dance when they see stronger rival dances. No one is persuaded, and no one is given orders. The system converges on a conclusion on its own. Here's the thing. According to research, this process almost always selects the highest quality location. Bee scientist Thomas Seeley studied this for years and compared it to human democracy. But with one key difference. People sometimes follow the loudest voice. Bees, however, follow proven quality. The system is immune to manipulation. Ultimately, that swarm taking off from your garden in the fall isn't flying randomly. It was discussed, evaluated, and decided days in advance. By the time that swarm takes flight, the voting is already over. 5. That single bee feeds nearly 70% of the world. We've arrived at one of the most important and valuable points. Now let's scale things up a bit. Let's scale them up a lot. 70% of human consumption worldwide depends on plants that rely on pollination. An apple, an almond, an avocado, a strawberry. For these to exist, a bee must land on that flower. Without bees, these plants cannot be produced, pollinated, or reproduced. It's not just food. Cotton, coffee, and cocoa are also part of this chain. So the coffee you drink in the morning, the t-shirt you wear, the chocolate you eat, all of them depend at some point on a bee landing on a flower. Now, I'd like to point out that a worker bee produces about 12 teaspoons of honey in its lifetime. That's all. But that same bee pollinates tens of thousands of flowers over its lifetime. Those flowers become fruit, then seeds, then new plants, which bloom again. It's a chain reaction of reproduction. And what happens when this chain is broken? Bee scientists have calculated it. A global collapse of bee populations would dramatically reduce agricultural yields. For some crops, there are no alternative pollinators. Those crops would either become prohibitively expensive or disappear entirely. This is not an abstract scenario. It's already happening in some regions. In addition, bee scientists have documented that colony collapse disorder has been accelerating in recent years. Pesticides are disrupting the bees' navigation system. They can't find their way back to their hives. Habitat loss is depleting their food sources. Parasites and fungal infections are eroding colonies from within. And right now, millions of hives are under this pressure. What does this mean for your garden? Every native flower you plant in your garden adds a food source. Every pesticide you spray disrupts a navigation system. Every small water dish you leave out helps a bee complete its daily marathon. That corner of your garden is part of a system much larger than you realize. As you can see, that bee you saw in the garden this morning. It landed on a lavender stem and took off in less than a second, as if nothing had happened. But in that 1 second, it carried the pollen it had loaded onto its body back to the hive. When it returned, it danced. The dance guided dozens of others there. The hive maintained its temperature, received the signal, and made its decision. And you spent that morning without seeing any of this. Because think about it this way. You thought it was empty. You thought it was ordinary. But that corner of the garden was functioning every morning as a logistics hub, an architectural workshop, a democratic square, and the infrastructure of a food system. You've been living right next to it for years. Now you know. I'd also like to ask you this. Have you ever noticed a bee circling in your garden as if it were dancing? Or that the same bee follows the exact same route every morning? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious. See you in the next videos.